Hello students, hope you are thorough with the previous concept what I have taught regarding the spinal cord followed by the primary regions of the brain. Now let us continue with the next part of the lesson, that is a peripheral nervous system. In the beginning when I taught you about the divisions of the nervous system, already you are familiar with the word PNS, that is a peripheral nervous system, which is divided into two parts known as a somatic nervous system followed by autonomic nervous system. Now let us study about the somatic nervous system. As we know that somatic nervous system comprises all those nerves which are moving towards the brain or the spinal cord, or arising from the brain or the spinal cord. I repeat, so thus you can say that the somatic nervous system comprises all those nerves which are entering into the brain or moving away from the brain, followed by the nerves which are entering into the spinal cord or moving out of the spinal cord. And what is the function of somatic nervous system? The somatic nervous system helps in controlling our skeletal muscles all over, or I can say our voluntary actions of the body. So these nerves which are emerging from the brain or the spinal cord convey the impulses to the voluntary muscles or the skeletal muscles. Now, somatic nervous system can be divided into two parts, or you can say that the nerves of the somatic nervous system are of two categories. The first one is known as a cranial nerves. So, what do you mean by cranial nerves? So, all those nerves which are emerging from the brain are known as cranial nerves. So, what is the location of the cranial nerves? The cranial nerves emerge from the brain. So, we have around 12 pairs of cranial nerves which are emerging from the brain, and these cranial nerves can be of any of the type of the nerves. Sometimes it can be a sensory nerve, it can be a motor nerve, or even it can be a mixed nerve. Right, children? I think we have learnt about the types of nerves in the earlier video. So the nerves are of three different kinds, known as a sensory nerves, motor nerves, and mixed nerve. So I said there are about 12 pairs of cranial nerves which are arising from the brain, and these 12 pairs of nerves can be of any one of the type. It can be sensory nerve. For an example, if you look at your eye, in the eye we have a nerve known as the optic nerve, which is a sensory nerve. In the ear we have a nerve known as the auditory nerve, which is also one more sensory nerve, right? So sometimes even it can be the motor nerve, such as the nerves which are emerging from the brain carrying the impulses to your eye muscles, making your eyeball to rotate. It can be one of the motor nerve, or sometimes it can be a mixed nerve, which are the nerves which are going to and coming from the face or the tongue. So whichever the nerves which are entering or moving out of the face and tongue can be named as a mixed nerves. Okay, so this is the first type of the somatic nervous system, that is the cranial nerves. What about the second set of nerves? The second set of nerves are known as a spinal nerves. So as the name indicates, it's very easy to remember. The spinal nerves are the nerves which are emerging from the spinal cord. Okay, so we have around 31 pairs of spinal nerves, right? So if they ask you the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, for the difference number, you have to be very clear. You have to mention it as 12 pairs and 31 pairs. You cannot write it as 24 or 62. So you cannot write it as 24 or a 62. Always you have to write in pairs. That is 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, these spinal nerves arise from different regions of the spinal cord. Now, from the neck region. From the neck region, we have around 8 pairs of spinal nerves arising from the neck region. Okay, so from the thoracic region, that is from the chest region, we have around 12 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay, then from the lumbar region, so from the lumbar region we have around 5 pairs of spinal nerves. Then again we have 5 more pairs of nerves which are arising from the sacrum. So this is the sacral region or a sacrum. This is the lumbar region, chest cavity, or what do we call it as a thoracic region. And we have last one pair arising from the coccygeal region, or what do we call it as a coccyx region. So if you look at the total number, this is about 1 pair. The total number of spinal nerves will be around 31 pairs. So thus I can say that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, where we have 8 pairs of spinal nerves arising from the neck region, or what do we call it as a cervical region, followed by 12 pairs of nerves from the thoracic region, or what do we call it as a chest cavity. Then we have 5 pairs of nerves arising from the lumbar region, again 5 pairs of nerves from the sacral region, and 1 pair of nerve from the coccygeal region. Yes, children, in the earlier case I said that the cranial nerves can be any of the kind of the nerves. It can be a sensory nerve, motor nerve, or a mixed nerve, right? But all the spinal nerves are the mixed nerves. Okay, so all the 31 pairs of spinal nerves are the mixed nerves. Now I think in the earlier video already we have learned about the spinal nerve or a spinal cord. Now let us learn about the spinal nerve, the structure of a spinal nerve. So we know that the spinal cord comprises 2 regions, right? The 2 regions, we know that we find a inner grey matter, outer white matter. Inner grey matter contains the cytons, outer white matter contains the axons, right? And the spinal cord comprises yes, so here you can say the structure of a spinal cord. Now children, the spinal nerve, I can say that this is the spinal nerve, right? And I said that every spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. Okay, so why do we call it as a mixed nerve? Because it contains both sensory and motor nerve fibers, right? Now we find the receptors which come in contact with the stimuli. So from the receptors we find the sensory neurons. The sensory neurons which are conducting the impulses from the receptors, which are entering into the spinal nerve, okay, and it also enters to one more part, okay. So this is a region, and this region, this part of a spinal nerve, we call it as a dorsal root. Okay, so I said every spinal nerve has a two roots. So this is the first root, we call it as a dorsal root. Okay, so in the dorsal root you can find that we find the sensory nerve fibers inside the dorsal root. And if you remember, children, sensory neuron has a dendrites, okay, reaching the receptors. And again we have this axon, right? Okay, and this axon, at a particular point we find the cyton, right? And again from the cyton we have one more axon emerging out, which enters into the spinal cord. Okay, so what do we have here? Here we have a aggregate of cell bodies, or a group of cytons, and the group of cytons collectively what we call it as a ganglion, right? So what I said, every spinal nerve has a one particular root known as a dorsal root. So what do we find in the dorsal root? In the dorsal root we find the sensory neurons which are carrying impulses. They are carrying the sensory impulses from receptors to the central nervous system or to the spinal cord. Okay, so again the spinal nerve has one more root. What do we find here? This is the second root, and this is the ventral root. So what do we find in the ventral root? When the impulses are conveyed to the spinal cord, from the spinal cord, you know, we find the cyton of the motor nerve fibers, or a motor neuron, which is carrying impulses towards the effectors. So we know that effectors are nothing but the muscles or a glands, right? Okay, so in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, we know that there is a association neuron. So you can say that every spinal nerve has two roots known as a dorsal root followed by ventral root, and in the dorsal root we find the sensory nerve fibers, and in the ventral root we find the motor nerve fibers. So sensory nerve fibers carry the sensory impulses from receptors to the spinal cord, and in the dorsal root we find a ovoid structure. Okay, so we find this ovoid structure, and this ovoid structure is due to the presence of aggregate of all those sensory neurons which have those cytons. So this is the ganglion, and we name this ganglion as a dorsal root ganglion. So thus you can say that the dorsal root comprises dorsal root ganglion, which contains the cluster of cell bodies of all those sensory neurons. Okay, whereas ventral root comprises the motor nerve fibers, which carries the impulses. What type of impulses? It carries the motor impulses towards the effectors, that is a muscles or glands, which is making them to undergo contraction or secreting the substance. Right, children? That is the reason I said every spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. Every spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. So you can see that at this junction we have both sensory nerve fibers followed by motor nerve fibers. So this is a junction. What do we call it? As a mixed nerve, because it contains both sensory nerve fibers followed by motor nerve fibers. So from this junction it separates to form the dorsal root and a ventral root. Now children, so where do we have this dorsal root? Children, in fact we have this dorsal root on our back side. That is, we have the dorsal root. I'll just draw it approximately. If this is a spinal cord, so if this is your front part of your body where you have a heart situated, right? So the other side is the back part where you have a vertebral column. So we find the dorsal root. So we find the dorsal root, which is from the back side. So in the dorsal root we find the sensory nerve fibers. Okay. So where do we have a ventral root? Children, we have a ventral root from our front side. That is, where do we have a heart? So at a particular junction, we have this dorsal root containing sensory nerve fibers and the ventral root containing motor nerve fibers. At a particular junction we have both these dorsal root and ventral root meeting, and this is a junction. What do we call it? As a spinal nerve. So what is the meaning of a dorsal root? Dorsal root means it is a root which is found on our backside, that is close to our backbone. Ventral root, in the sense, it's a root which is arising from the front part of the body where we have a heart. Okay, so thus you can say that every spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. And children, if you observe carefully, the dorsal root opens into the horn-like structure. So if you observe carefully, it looks like a horn-like structure. So dorsal root enters into the horn, which is on the dorsal side. So we call it as a dorsal root entering into the dorsal horn, and the ventral root entering into the ventral horn-like structure. So you can name this as a ventral horn, this as a dorsal horn. So thus the dorsal root enters into the dorsal horn, the ventral root enters into the ventral horn. Children, this is one of the expected question for the diagram. Okay, in case if they ask you to label few parts, just observe carefully. If they ask you to label this part, you're going to label it as motor nerve fiber. What you're going to label that as? You're going to label that as a motor nerve fiber, but not a neuron, right? Because it is a nerve fiber or an axon of a motor neuron. You cannot label it as a motor neuron. It has to be labeled as a motor nerve fiber. In the same way, what can we label this as? We can label this as a sensory nerve fiber. Fine? Okay? But if they point at the first line and the third line, so you're going to label it as ventral root. So the middle line represents the nerve fiber. First and the third line represents the ventral root. Again here, this first line followed by the third line represents the dorsal root, and the middle line represents the sensory nerve fiber. Okay? So thus you can say that every spinal nerve is a mixed nerve.